Thank you, Tom, for providing a nice, calming introduction. So now I can feel calm talking to all of you early in the morning. Tom asked me to come, I think, as a representative of governmental agency botanists. So part of my task today is to talk from the perspective of such a group of people. And I'm looking out in the audience and I see many other agency botanists, so I know I'm not alone. If you were to ask me 20 or 25 years ago when I started working as a full-time agency botanist, what do agency botanists do? These are some of the things I would say. And I think in general, today, 25 or so years later, all of these things tend to hold true. But in many cases, they're more refined, or in some cases, they've actually been modified. Not so much collection and analysis, more asking other people to collect and analyze and reinterpret, for example. In my darkest hours of despair and depression, I sort of look back upon these points here, where I remember in the early 90s when there were botanists and plant ecologists and all the Forest Service districts around the state, and that there was this new visionary legislation like the Natural Communities Conservation Planning Laws and relatively new laws on endangered species that were guiding us in visionary ways, and we were relying on scientific principles to move us forward in the proper direction. And it's hard to say whether some of those things are still happening as a member in the milieu of the frenetic activity that we all do as agency botanists. So this talk was actually valuable for me to kind of step back and look at our own history and get a sense of perspective. One of the questions I kind of ask myself is what are the trends in staff botanists in some of these agencies like the Department of Fish and Wildlife or California Division of Forestry and Fire Protection or BLM and so forth. And I started looking into this by trying to look into listservs and agency email lists and org charts, and it became difficult to tell outside of some of my own most familiar agencies that I work with who really were the botanists and who were really sort of policy wonks and analysts. But judging from my own perspective, I've seen surprisingly about the same number of botanists in many of the agencies that I'm most familiar with, for example, the Forest Service. However, plant ecologists have dwindled in the Forest Service. There are province ecologists that handle a few parts of the state as opposed to forest ecologists that work pretty much on every one of the 17 or so national forests in the state. These priorities have changed. We're more into fire and fuels management, for example, if you're a Forest Service ecologist than you are in classifying vegetation, that may actually be appropriate. In my own agency, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, I was pleasantly surprised to extract the listserv that Sherilyn Britton keeps for us. Almost exactly the same number of people, about 20 or 37 on this botany listserv, as were around in the early 90s when I started working there. Now, these folks may do other things. Some of them are more environmental scientists, they're land managers, they're GIS analysts and technicians, or even program managers or deputy directors. But they are botanists at heart, and that comes through in many interesting ways, some of which I hope to share with you in the next few minutes. So we all may feel like we're wallowing in seas of bromus tinctorum and desperania. Sophia, sometimes we can step back and realize that we have a leg up. No. Sorry, I didn't say that. But we have been reduced in number in some ways. But really, paradoxically, in some ways, a although the numbers are reduced, the quality has been ensured, and sort of that all-encompassing set of experiences that many of the agency botanists have are in many ways broader than they were 20 or 25 years ago. One of the most frustrating things, if I look back on these halcyon days of the early 90s, where you had more official botanists and plant ecologists and certain agencies, was I realized that, God, there was this spate of 3 or so different statewide evaluations of biodiversity, where some sort of legislative action or some sort of government dictum came down to say, we must go out and figure out what we have and analyze it and then make some decisions. And of course, there was no time because you have to have it in 6 months to get new data, so they kept rehashing all of this, mass quantities of old data. And that's when we started realizing that just isn't going to cut it, because all these things fell short. They sort of quietly or quickly ended in a little fizzle of activity. And that's really because a lot of the data that they needed was inconclusive or inadequate. And one of the things that came out of that era for many of us, I think, was we need context and appropriate information. And some of these points that I list here sort of get at that. And these are other things that I want to discuss in this series of vignettes that I'm going to talk to you about. Basically, it was very difficult for me to come up with a reduced number. I finally chosen 3 of these little stories to tell. I started out with 5 or 6 and realized I could never do justice to that many in the amount of time that I have. But the theme, of course, is cooperation, interagency cooperation between disciplines within the same agency, moving around to different parts of the state and see how this kind of coordinated conservation activity sometimes works with natural resource agencies, and then robust and hopefully or proved useful outcomes. The first one I'm going to talk about is vernal pools. Very familiar, quintessential California plant community, lots of rare plant species and animal species, a lot of loss in habitat due to things like agriculture initially and more recently suburban development and so forth. Big focus on statewide conservation in the late 80s and early 90s due to federal and state legislation. This kind of came to a head in the early 90s when there was some initial mapping that suggested that we've already lost 90% of vernal pools in the Central Valley. Fish and Wildlife Service and feds got together with then Fish and Game, the state, and started working on what turned out to be the largest ever single recovery plan in the state, sort of driven by these notions of we've got 33 species, 20 of them federally listed. How are we going to protect these things now that we've been left with this fragmented situation? But one of the interesting things was the recovery plan listed a bunch of action items. And it wasn't as if we knew the answers and we had the resources to get all this information. We actually had to figure out how to get it. And that's why the recovery plan took over 10 years to develop. But it was actually a very fruitful 10 years. It was understood that vernal pools varied immensely in their known range. They varied regionally from relatively cool, moist vernal pool settings in the North Coast Ranges and the Modoc Plateau, and on the east side of the Sierras down to almost desert-like conditions in the southern San Joaquin Valley, for example. However, the classification of vernal pools was really based on a limited set of data, mostly from the Central Valley and mostly from anecdotal observations in a few other places. We didn't really have a sense of where they were, and therefore we really couldn't figure out how to mitigate from any sort of losses or changes in their environment and composition. So one of the first things my program began to get involved in was, how do we figure out biogeographically where vernal pools in the state are? And we looked at this from the standpoint of the Natural Diversity Database, where there at the time was the best single list of biogeographically accurate recordings that were digitally available to us. So we looked at where those rare species were. We looked at sort of the suite of environmental variables, soils, geology, climatic regimes, and so forth they were associated with, and came up with this map of 17 vernal pool regions, which ranged from southern Oregon all the way down to at least the border of Mexico and certainly south of that a bit. And when we looked at these different regions, we realized that there were just a huge variety of different kinds of vernal pools. And the agencies got together along with CNPS. We had several symposia during those years in the early to mid-90s where we actually discussed things like the environmental gradients that drive vernal pool biology and ecology. And we started understanding more and more about what really it was to be a vernal pool. How did inundation period, how did soil and water chemistry, how did seasonal variability influence these things? So we kind of were armed with those basic environmental ideas. And then what happened was there was actually the notion to go out and sample, believe it or not, all of the vernal pool types in the state to get some sort of floristic classification of what held them all together. And this was primarily done by a group led by Michael Barber at UC Davis with some of the luminaries of the vernal pool world, collecting data, much like the BTM surveys back in the 30s when you had famous people like Daniel Axelrod running around looking at mountaintops and mapping vegetation. It was a great group of people. They collected over 2,000 samples. They collected pools from the aspects of stands of vegetation. So each of those bands is a stand. The pool itself is not the entity, it's the bands of vegetation in the pool. So they would break the pool into different categories and sample those categories. Then that data was analyzed numerically, phytosociologically, and we came up with defensible definitions that were driven by diagnostic species that, for example, were characteristic of long inundation pools that were in cool areas, or flashy inundation pools that were alkaline and in desert areas. And that's where this classification system arose that is actually being used in many ways now to help drive vernal pool conservation at a finer scale. So these classification concepts, just to summarize, included, yes, we know vernal pools have cyclic dynamics that are driven yearly by variation in climate and precipitation. They're obviously not static, but interestingly enough, there is some sort of core group of species that tend to be persistent, and they stay there in most, normal to high rainfall years, so you can see them if you go out at the right time. Those are the things that actually drive the classification of the pools. So now we know how to classify the pools, and we had information on that. Now we had to find out exactly where they were, and then find out what kinds were in what places in more specific ways. And vernal pool mapping is not easy, and a lot of people took them out at the county level, at the individual consulting firm levels, and everybody kind of went about it in a different way. It turned out that really the best way to do it on sort of a regional basis was to think of vernal pools as landscape units, and think of individual pools as individuals, and then estimate the cover of those individuals in a landscape unit. So this is work that Carol Witham, Bob Holland, John Volmar, and others worked on, which is really kind of the best overall view of vernal pool density and distribution, particularly in the Central Valley. And we can overlay that onto our vernal pool region map, and we can see basically that, yes, here's what's left of the vernal pools, even though this seems to be based sort of edaphically and biogeographically on what they used to look like or what their regions used to look like. Some of those gaps there, like that one shown in the arrow, is a completely anthropogenic map. That's our gap. That's not a phytogeographic gap. That's basically the corridor of Highway 80 that runs up east and northeast of Sacramento. There are no more pools like there used to be. So we can drill down into this mapping and we can see many things. We can look at the different densities of pools, associate them with soil type and development plans. The brown margins around these things are the core recovery areas that Fish and Wildlife Service actually identified after this kind of mapping was done, where they're focusing most of the conservation and recovery for the species that are in the list package. We can look more closely over time because now Carol and Bob and others have done this twice. So you can see what things looked like in 2005 and then again in 2010 and realize, yes, there are indeed losses, and those losses can be divided into different categories, and then you can sort of see, well, here's where it looks like we've allowed too much development, and here's where a lot of new rural creation is taking place and actually added some acres and those sorts of things. And just mentioning rural creation makes me think about that whole process and how do you monitor sort of humans playing God? How do you determine whether a created pool is actually a successfully created pool that should be considered for mitigation? Again, we look back at our classification as the tool to do this. If the created pool actually holds the species that are supposed to be there and those species persist, then it's a good pool. So that's another way we look at our floristic classification as a tool. So in short, it was driven by rare plants and animals. We started with this general concept. We refined the notion, looking at pools broken into components of stands, and then we went down into the landscape level, looked at biogeographic and internal functions, and came up with a functional recovery plan. It took a long time, but it seems like it's as well scientifically based as any that I've seen so far, and I think that's a success story. So that's vignette number one. The next story I want to talk about is the much forgotten grasslands of the state. This is a map that was created for a book that we worked on several years back called The Grasslands of California. You see press publication, and in that book we just identified major areas of grassland ecosystems in the state, at least as thought to be the case prior to European colonization. So we have our Central Valley grassland, which is typically Mediterranean climate dry summer grassland. We have North Coastal grassland, and we also have cool desert and warm desert grasslands. I'm going to talk mostly about that Central Valley Mediterranean style right now. There's an interesting statistic that comes out of looking at the CNPS rare plant inventory. If you query based on grassland species, you come up with 332 grassland species that are listed at some level as rare. Only 2 of those are presumed extinct, interestingly enough. And that suggests some interesting things, which I want to discuss a little bit. This was our early classification back in the mid-80s of grassland vegetation in California. The rarest stuff that was mostly based on perennial species like, for example, Coascatenda, which is that pine bluegrass, or valley needlegrass, Stipropulchra. There was one category called non-native grassland, which was thought of as the trash pit for everything that was non-native. And then there was this interesting and enigmatic type called wildflower field, which nobody really knew how to define, except it looked really pretty whenever you saw it. So we started classifying vegetation through the CNPS initiative back in '95 when we published our first manual of California vegetation. And at that time, we make this comment, which you probably can't read, but it says, the fine-scale variation in temporal and spatial structure found in the California annual grassland suggests that recognition of many different types is not useful. So we were basically writing it off even back in 1995. And it's just a bunch of variable weeds. But I suggest you look at this picture, which has lots of variable weeds in it, and look at this picture. And other than the fact that there are lots of annuals and they're mostly yellow, they say that there's a huge amount of difference between a black mustard stand and a Lastenia stand that goes for thousands of acres. So the problem was nobody had really sampled grasslands other than for grazing studies, which were looking mostly at productivity and not at diversity. there's a big problem when you think about seasonal annual variation and have sampled those grasslands. There's scales of assessment. We didn't have the tools really to look biogeographically at the variation. And we didn't really think about that there were any landscapes left where you could get a sense of, well, here's how the grassland ecosystem functions. And then we started doing our veg classification work where we would do these projects that would sort of take a representative sample of all types of vegetation allocated across, say, the eastern Mojave Desert or western Riverside County, and we wouldn't just look at the chaparral or just look at the Carrizo bush scrub. We'd try to capture every single type of standard vegetation there was. And then we realized that there were really a lot of different kinds of herbaceous vegetation that may have had non-natives in them, but they certainly were characterized, as are those vernal pools, by interesting local, or at least environmentally constrained native species. So this is just a piece of the key out of our second annual that came out in 2009. But still, that wasn't enough detail to really understand the full suite of annual grasslands. So I want to tell this story from the aspect of big conservation driving little conservation, driving knowledge. And so the Carrizo Plain was identified through the TNC Great Places Initiative back in the 1980s as the single best and largest remaining California grassland ecosystem. And I think that they're still right. So the Carrizo National Monument obviously became an outcome of that purchase through TNC, and now the mission of that National Monument and Management Partners is really to maintain this dynamic system in perpetuity and maintaining opportunities for compatible scientific research and so forth. And born out of that mission was the Carrizo Science Collaborative Research Community that involved agency people, that involved biologists and botanists from UC Berkeley and other academic institutions into understanding baseline functionality of this ecosystem. One of the first priorities was to get vegetation data. The Carrizo is this amazing place. It has this huge variety of substrate topography in this very dry, almost desert-like, but still Mediterranean climate. So we allocated our samples. We went out and put our releves out. We had well over 500 releves that CMPS worked on, and Fish and Wildlife collaborated with them to do this. This was a contract with the Bureau of Land Management. So there's that sort of interdigitation of NGOs and government at the state and government at the federal level. And then we came up with this way to allocate those samples based on sort of the biogeophysical approach of you use your GIS, you look at your soils information, you look at your topography, you allocate samples based on what we think would be the drivers of vegetation controlling in that ecosystem. Then we came up with a classification, which really gave us a much better sense of what was going on ecologically with this huge suite of annual and perennial herbaceous vegetation. We developed keys so you could identify these things in the field, much like you could identify the vernal pool types in the field in a normal year. This not being one of them. We were down there and there's hardly a sprig of anything in green, but in many years there's at least a few sprigs. And then we tried to map it. And the mapping, of course, is now based on this fantastically accurate and detailed fine resolution imagery. It's almost like being there. You can identify the boundaries of the stands based on the rules that have been set up. You can map them. You can allocate information to your density and cover of different species, and thereby get a much better sense of what's there and what quality and what variability there is. This classification work and mapping work provided the foundation for a number of other studies that have either recently been finished or currently ongoing on the Carrizo and driving management goals. One of the things that I wanted to mention is that we love the Berkeley mapper, and I just wanted to, sort of applaud the Jepson Herbarium folks for doing this, because this really helps us understand contextually a lot of what's going on with some of the vegetation types that we're coming up with. These three maps depict three rare species Atriplex coronata, molecula, Asthenia feraceae, Leukinium gerida, and these are rare species that in most of California are just known from fragmentary populations scattered in sort of tantalizingly interesting combinations, mostly in the drier parts of the Silicon Valley ecosystem. But interestingly enough, this turned out to be a vegetation type on the Carrizo. That's what you see in the blue outline polygons in that interestingly shaped figure on the right side, which is essentially the salt playa of Soda Lake and the terraces immediately adjacent to it. So these three species actually have a coincidence which is not necessarily simultaneous and not necessarily even on a yearly basis regularly apparent. But you look at the conditions and you look at enough of the stands and you realize all three of these species co-occur and they actually define this ecosystem which still exists in this one place in the world, and it's the Carrizo plain. So that gives us a real good understanding of what were the conditions under which these species grew, evolved, and coexisted in sort of the primordial pre-European Central Valley ecosystem. Geologic controls are extremely important in the Carrizo and elsewhere in herbaceous vegetation around California. Here we have that former picture showing that band of yellow, and this picture showing the map that, So this is basically that yellow band we were seeing in the former picture. Those little red dots are our sample points, which tell us what was there on the ground, because even with our great imagery, you can't really see the flower heads of Monolopia and Sedona. But this is an accurate map. And we really learned a lot about individual species that were sort of part of this unusual and unfamiliar but seductive name called the wildflower fields. And basically, interestingly enough, it all sorts out. So there's predictability in a lot of these wildflower field patterns, and you can map it. So it almost looks like Monolopia lanceolata is spelling out like International Association of Vegetation Science. Yeah, but it's interesting like that is these things really do occur on neutral slopes, sort of general steepness, and it's all like they're facing one direction. And in a good year, you really see those patterns, and therefore you can map those patterns. It's predictable. So the great thing is that these gorgeous patterns you see in a flashy El Nino year are actually meaningful and predictable. They're not just some fluke, but you have to know how to interpret them. You have to understand that there's disturbance tolerant types vegetation, like the Amsychia alliance, which also includes things like Facilia ciliata, which in certain types of rainfall years just can blanket huge areas of the Carrizo. And all that information is driving realizations in a lot of these other ecosystem partnership studies that are going on there, like what LeConte Thrasher is like in terms of shrub density and herbaceous understory, or where Pronghorn Antelope should be at different times of the year, whether they're fawning or whether they're foraging. And interestingly enough, what giant kangaroo rats do to this entire ecosystem. So this is this little critter that Laura Prue is holding here, and amazingly enough, they do landscape engineering. Some of you probably know this. But this is a mound known as a kangaroo rat precinct, where a small group of kangaroo rats live and hang out and burrow in unearthed vegetation. And you'll note that there's lots of Amsychia sitting on that mound. And what happens is that these mounds grow different vegetation than what turns out to be the foraging lands for the kangaroo rats beyond their mounds. So kangaroo rats are like miniature compounds. They're basically harvesting huge amounts of Lastenia and other annual herbs in a good year. They're basically mowing them down. And if you stand back and look at this, you can see these patterns. And if you stand back even further from an aerial image, you can see those patterns, and you can see how they change over a period of 5 or 10 years. I'm not going to go back and point out individual ones, but these have actually been mapped out. And this is essentially like tilling the landscape with a Carrizo plane, kangaroo style. So they're essentially turning over the entire soil over a 10-year period. And there's high activity areas, and then there's fallow areas, and there's sort of intermediate areas. And so we're actually looking at the ecosystem driven by these tiny little rodents. They're now, of course, endangered. And yet all of these species and all these combination of species are still out based on that disturbance regime that were driven by canines. So this is an example of these great realizations that I think come out of interactions of federal and state and NGO agencies working together with this core of advisors that have a vision of ecosystem conservation and comprehension. So just to kind of reiterate, back in the 80s, California grassland was this boulder community. And now we understand ecological relationships, we understand how this ecosystem really functioned and what drove it and how important it was for the evolution of species in California, and we can use this understanding for many things. So this is my last story. How much work do I have for 15? Okay, good. So this is a story about multi-species conservation planning in a different way. This is not driven by the Endangered Species Act, state or federal. This is driven by these so-called habitat conservation planning or regional conservation planning authorities like HCPs if you're a federal agency, or natural community conservation plans if you're a state agency. And basically the purpose of these things, this is sort of a cynical view, but I think it's absolutely true. The purpose is to allow for development and urbanization of whatever area it is that's being planned for through establishment of legal incidental take. In other words, you can destroy and remove listed species if you design an appropriate system of reserves, which, if it's scientifically credible and believed to set up a long perpetuating set of reserves and will protect these species. So that's really what's going on throughout much of the state, throughout many counties, throughout many ecoregions. And they call these natural community conservation plans because the tag is vegetation. It's sort of like back in the 90s, people realized that habitat is where it's at, and vegetation is often the best place to sort of think about habitat, or the best sort of notion to use to think about habitat for many species. And therefore, one was, if you were to do an NCCP, one was to map the habitat using vegetation information, and then sort of figure out, well, where's the best habitat for each of the species that we're thinking about, and where should we set up our reserves? Now in the past, as you saw from some of those early classification systems, a lot of these natural communities were not really informed by the information that I talked to you about in these first two vignettes. We had poor data, we had sort of this anecdotal, non-quantitative definition of these things, which people could sort of force back and forth. This is San Diegan coastal sage scrub, this is River Cityan coastal sage scrub. Don't ask me to tell you the exact differences, but I know that that's one and that's the other. That went on a lot, and so we ended up getting these maps that were supposedly driving the natural community plans that really were indefensible. And therefore, the acquisition, the sort of corridors, the core reserves that were going to be developed for these plans were also indefensible, and they were politically expedient. So now we know a lot more. And what I want to talk about is how we're using that knowledge to help conservation and what can be actually a very effective planning process, in my opinion. So we have much better ability to quantify and map vegetation. We realize that habitat models for species X, Y, or Z, how they could be most appropriately used. Sometimes vegetation is not the key driver. Sometimes it's something else, but we have this suite of GIS-based data that's now available to us, so we can pick and choose the appropriate habitat elements for the appropriate species and make much better predictions about where would be the best place for that species to survive, or what kind of network would be needed to ensure the survival of that species. We still need maps of vegetation, but we don't need to really pigeonhole all of the species in this generic kind of habitat map. So a case in point is this huge planting effort out in the warm deserts called the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan, or DRECP, or DRECP, or DREPP, or whatever you call it. So there's a lot of new mapping that went on in this area that's based on the likely places where energy development is going to be, mostly in the West Mojave. And so this was a huge effort that, again, was a collaborative one with consulting firms, multiple agencies, CNPS, Fish and Wildlife, BLM, State Department of Fish and Wildlife, among others. And it was a big push to get this done. But the amazing thing was, here was the case where we actually demanded that we get new information before people start making decisions on where to put those plants. So we have footing. We were actually able to pull this off, barely, but we did. And here's some of the stuff you can find out based on this new mapping. Where the rare entities, the rare natural communities are, of course. What is the appropriate habitat for listed species like this Mojave ground squirrel? Where are the higher quality locations for some of these habitats based on ancillary information on invasive exotic cover, which we can now map with this great imagery. We can see creosote bush scrub with red brome versus creosote bush scrub with lacinium underneath it, for example. So you can really identify lots of things. And then we can even go further and do things that we've never really thought possible by justifying things like conservation of locally unique vegetation. The other thing that is great about this whole process is now that we have this nationally driven classification system, we actually have a hierarchical nestedness that we can apply to the planning operation. So if you have desert-wide concerns, you could go broad and talk about these broad-scale general communities at one level of hierarchy. If you have sort of sub-regional issues that revolve around, say, sand dunes in the West Mojave versus sand dunes in the East Mojave, you can go to the mid-level group or macro group, we call it in the national classification. Or if you have specific fairness scale levels, you can go to the Alliance or even the Plant Association, the finer levels. That's actually written into the plan and written into the way the plan document works. So there's biological goals and objectives for rare communities at the fine scale. There's biological goals and objectives for the broader communities like dunes, that apply to all dunes, for example. So this is very satisfying. It makes sense and it feels more compatible with the science that we now know from our current understanding of vegetation. An interesting thing that I was talking about is taking this to the next step. So this process is still driven by rare things that are defined through sort of legislatively understood ideas of rarity, like the heritage methodology and the natural diversity database lists rare plants based on whether they're globally or state rare at different ranking levels with different criteria. And if you don't meet those criteria, you don't get protected. And that's the same thing with vegetation. Rare communities, natural communities, also are listed by global and state ranks. And if your community is beautiful and interesting and valuable ecologically as you think it is an S4, there's no legislatively mandated way through CEQA or through other processes to really protect it. But we're now working with another way of thinking about this. If you subdivide up the landscape in this huge area of 23 million acres in the ecoregions, you can think about rarity at the local, sort of sub-regional level. And this really helps apply conservation and management where it's needed. And I just wanted to give you some ideas. This very fuzzy view, and I made it intentionally fuzzy because it's extremely fuzzy and inaccurate. I'm not going to talk about who did it. This is
what we would have been left with had we not done that map. This is basically a selection of what was thought of based on very general information of where the high-risk areas versus low-risk areas. Risk meaning, there's relatively low risk in those dark blue areas. You could build a solar facility that could cover that entire area and it wouldn't really affect anything biologically or ecologically as far as we know. So that's what I mean. And this was what was going to be used to make the decisions if we didn't make our map. Now we have a map that sort of has a more finer-grained, detailed view of that same area. And this is the stuff that's coming out of that map. So we all know the Willow Valley still has probably the absolute best wildflower displays of any place in the state. This is what Rich Minnick talks about in his book, The Fading Wildflowers of California. It's been written up in many places. We have a poppy preserve that state parks maintains. And yet, this is an S4 community. It's not rare by the typical standards. So is it fine to hand this stuff over? What laws do we have? So basically, and here's another interesting example. There's this interesting suite of vegetation and species that sort of rides the saddle of the Tehachapi's. Goes out into the West Mojave, doesn't go very much further than that Mediterranean influence high in the sort of modality of winter rainfall before you get into the Central and East Mojave where it's more final in the summer and winter. And so there's these interesting mixes, like in that upper left-hand corner, this is Coreopsis calypsidia with Atriplex vinifera, and that's a common plant community in that part of the West Mojave. And lo and behold, we're going back on the right to the edge of Soda Lake, the Carrizo Plain, and we see almost, but not quite, the same community. We see the Coreopsis, we see Atriplex, but with it is Poa secunda, which is different than what's with it in the Kramer Junction area of the Mojave. There you have 3 or 4 species of annual Areogonus that you don't find on the Carrizo. So this is what we would call a plant association level difference. Same general alliance, but there is ecological differentiation. And it's the same thing with the poppy fields. The poppy fields of the West Mojave are genetically different than they are in the Coast Ranges. They are compositionally different, even though in a mass farming they're just as beautiful. So what we've done is we've been able to map out these locally rare, unique associations with the better imagery that we have. And we can actually put those in the context of the plan and say, we know that there's only 12 occurrences that are under 7,000 acres of good poppy fields within the high priority planting areas where it's very likely that there will be solar or wind developments placed. So we can tell you that this is a rare community and you can't really build here. You have to mitigate and avoid. And this is actually, the plan is now going through environmental review. The final draft is out, but this is written into the plan. And as far as we've been able to tell, we may be able to uphold this. So this is a new tool, a new handle that would really help us in sort of those gray areas. How do we conserve based on existing laws? A lot of collaboration on this project with some of the agencies and organizations. So I want to conclude. How much do I have? Less than 1 minute? Okay, good. Perfect. How did that happen? So, yes, things have changed. Things always change. Change is not necessarily bad. Maybe we have, fewer botanists working out in the field collecting raw data in some agencies, but we're now thinking about how to do conservation, in my opinion. And the remaining biologists are better trained. They have a great breadth of information available to them, and interestingly enough, most of them know how to use it. They're not just lab botanists. They also know how to do GIS analysis. They know how to have face-to-face conversations with their peers, or virtual conversations, as well as often the case, with their peers. And we also understand now that we can't and won't settle for just existing information. We can ask more, and we should demand more, and we know what kind of information to ask for. So this is harkening back to the question, well, what are we doing? Is there hope at all? Is there a plan? No, of course there's not a plan. You know, this is the thing we have to realize, right? There's no plan, there's no realistic plan that can take us way into the future. There's ideas about where things will go. But the vision is what I'm talking about. Conserving functional ecosystems by understanding nature and all of its processes, and better define the roles of various agencies to cooperate and work together. Who's going to take charge of what? And you know, the sum is greater than the whole of the parts. I think this works much better now than it did 20 or 25 years ago. And so have we progressed? Yeah, we were fighting for endangered species, but we didn't really know the tools to use. And we just have the principle and the moral conviction, and nobody would ever give us time to actually collect the right amount of information. Now we have a better idea of what we need in the context in which we need to use it, and we are fighting for these landscape principles in our agencies to get that kind of establishment. Biologists are being asked to understand and incorporate more. We have more fluidity and actually more desire, I think, to have these trans-disciplinary activities. It's fascinating to sit down with a Delta visioning group that's got the best hydrologists and geomorphologists and botanists and fish biologists sitting in the same room thinking about, you know, how the heck are we going to preserve this sad little, you know, semblance of the Delta that once was. But much better hope with that group of people, that type of communication. So, going back to what do we do as government biologists, I'm going to switch and say what do we need to do. You know, like Tom mentioned, we need to bring in new young people. Thank you for being here, new young people. Thank you for asking other new young people to come in. Some of us are getting tired. Or at least not as agile as we used to be. We need to raise the awareness within agencies that botany matters, that it really does answer many questions. It's not just pretty plants and obscure, you know, Latin names. Colleges and universities need to see this again. I really do believe that there should be a pipeline through education that gets us better botany people. And then we need to raise the bar for standards. I mean, we need to uphold the laws to protect plants, and we need to not be afraid to tweak them and push them to the limits that we think are appropriate. And so therefore, everybody that I know who's a botanist has, you know, sort of this inner core of, you know, this ethos and this moral conviction to do the right thing. And they all work more than 40 hours a week. And none of them, you know, play Tetris quietly at their workstation. At least not on a good day. And then, as I said, embrace change. And, you know, everything's going to change. We have to be receptive to it. There's no room for the lone wolf biologist who doesn't talk to anybody anymore and just goes out on their own and finds out something cool. That's fine. If you're a researcher, you have a great question, and there's places, hopefully, that are in academic institutions to do that, but it's not really in place for a state or federal government agency. In other words, you have to have good social skills, as well as good botanical skills, good networking skills. And I think that's it. I listed a short number of people that shared slides with me. There are many more, but I don't know if we have any more time. Thanks very much.